Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's catechesis. Before we start, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loves mankind, with the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand your gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of your most blessed commandments, so that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well pleasing unto thee. You are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto thee do ascribe all glory, together with your fathers from everlasting, and your all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, so just to give us a recap on what we have been speaking about, we've been speaking about the topic of marriage. Last week we discussed the beginning stages, right? How to look for a partner, and what's the appropriate way to journey towards marriage. But tonight I wanted us to speak about the actual married life, particularly looking at examples of married couples in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and lives of the saints. So we won't be able to go into depth into any one of them. I would suggest that you can read up about many of these people we'll be speaking about in more detail yourselves. But I wanted us to look at the examples of marriage, and sometimes the failures and also the victories and the glory that we see in married couples, and how they work out their salvation together. So let me share the screen so you can see the slides. I'll do the entire screen. Just so everyone knows, you're welcome at any time to ask questions. Yeah, so anytime you want to ask a question, just switch on your microphone and you can ask. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the slides. Okay, so why are we speaking about marriage? Marriage, in the Christian perspective, is for the majority of us is an important part of our experience of salvation, because Christ himself came as a bridegroom, marrying himself to the Holy Church, and so that relationship that we see between Christ and his church is lived out also in a married couple, between husband and wife. And therefore, it's a very important, not everyone is called to marriage, of course, as we know in Orthodox. There are other callings that a person can have, particularly monastic life. But we're speaking specifically about marriage in these next few lessons. And this is a way in which we learn about selflessness, so how to get rid of our ego and our selfishness, how to learn about love, how to pull out potential from one another, and how to build a family. So many amazing things come from a marriage. We take it for granted, but these are really sacred, beautiful things that all come out of a marriage. And of course, this is clearly the case because when God created man, we see immediately a marriage, right? God creates Adam, and he seeks a fitting partner for him, and a fitting partner comes from his side, from his own self, and a kind of opposite, in a way, opposite, but also a mirror reflection of him. And this is what God ordained. So he ordained this right in the beginning, that the creatures and the animals, and including mankind, is made in male and female, and that they should come together and be one body. And this is specifically, let's just say, it's much more vivid in the narrative of the creation of Adam and Eve. This was quite unique. And so we need to see that this is a God-ordained institution, if you want to say, of marriage, and it's a path to salvation. So what is important, though, is our understanding that our perspective of marriage, how we've seen marriage lived out, whether it's in our own families or in the people we know, or even when we read the scriptures about the various married couples in that we meet in the Old Testament, for example, that their marriages have been impacted by sin, and so they bear the scars of sin. And so the scriptures are very clear that many of the people in the Bible, just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that it's all good. The Holy Scriptures also show us the complications, the difficulties, the struggles that married couples had. So I think that's important. A lot of people say, but that's biblical, or that's in the Bible. A lot of things are in the Bible, but the Bible doesn't make a claim that everything that's written in there is only good examples. So, we see examples of the problems of polygamy, problems of divorce, with faithfulness, and various other things. And I think we also should enter into marriage ourselves when we find a partner and we seek to marry them. We should remember that we're fighting against our fallen human nature. And this is something that, let's just say, the postmodern person doesn't have that perspective. So, for example, if a person comes in with certain expectations or desires, they have no understanding that maybe that desire they have is not a good desire, right? Just because we have an impulse or some kind of feeling, we shouldn't take that as always being the truth, and that our sin can blind us to certain things. So, like a good example is, someone gets absolutely infatuated with someone, their beauty, their outward beauty. Meanwhile, that person is not a good candidate. They're not loving to them or anything, but they'll forget all of that. They've been blinded by their lustful sin. That's a very simple example, but there's many other more intricate things. So when we enter into our marriages, we should understand both partners are coming in having been affected by their sin. And so it is important to struggle against that, to have a spiritual life, to have a ascetical life in our marriages, so that we can turn back our fallen nature. And this, of course, Christ helps us with. This is what our personal journey is in church, but also our communal journey, especially as a community in the church and as married couples. Okay. So, as I was saying, we see so many times in the Old Testament how really most of the narratives are about families, family units that remain faithful to God, that God chose to do a particular thing. And one of them, of course, is the story of Noah and his wife. In fact, I don't think Noah's wife is, she's not named, I think, in the scripture. But we know that he was a righteous man and his family was righteous. And so their family, in the narrative of Noah's Ark, right, basically was chosen by God to preside over this mission of salvation, right, where they created this ark, this place, this wooden place of salvation, was not only for them but also for the animals. But it was the family themselves who let's just say facilitated this work of God's salvation. It was a family. It wasn't Noah and his friends, his guy friends. It was Noah and his wife and his children and their spouses that were chosen for this act of salvation, and their righteousness became the potential for their progeny to fight their children and their children's children to bring forth the Messiah, right? Bring forth goodness back into the earth. When all mankind had become wicked and evil, it was a family, a good, righteous family that brought salvation. And we see this, of course, repeat itself with Abraham and Sarah, and ultimately with Mary and Joseph, right? The Holy Family, and with the birth of Jesus Christ. So we see how God works through salvation, not through a political project, not through a new economic system, not through, I don't know, war campaign. Generally, God works his salvation through the family. and beginning with the husband and the wife. So look how high God holds marriage, such high esteem. Okay. So I wanted us to look at some couples of the Old Testament and meditate on some aspects of their marriage. I'm going to first look at the good things. Okay. There are some bad things. Now, of course, probably if you were going to say who's the first couple of the Old Testament, and most people say Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah were a righteous couple, and Sarah was barren. She couldn't have children. And what we do see is that Abraham remained together with Sarah. He loved her dearly, was the wife of his youth, and he didn't put her away because he couldn't have children with her. And we see that God himself ultimately, I think it was, through Abraham's, of course, through his faithfulness, but also his faithfulness to his wife, and the fact that they had patiently borne with the difficulty of not having children, that God blessed Sarah with a child, Isaac, who we'll speak about a bit later. Now, one of the things that we do notice, though, in the Old Testament with these married couples is that they often married more than one wife. And this was the case also with Abraham. Now, it's interesting. Sarah actually, this was the act of kind of where they faltered a bit in their actions. So I want to read directly from Genesis what happened. So let's read it and then we can speak about it. Now, Sarai, so they had not been renamed yet by God. So Sarah, so Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian maidservant. So that's basically a slave. The English uses maidservant or servant, but it's slave. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid unto your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do as to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So we see here the first cracks of this marriage, right? Of course, this is post-fall. So first of all, when we think of polygamy, this is not some kind of sexually motivated thing in general. Polygamy in the Old Testament has a lot to do with building up the family. And every family, every clan, their main purpose was to produce heirs to continue their bloodline. That's something that's only quite recently come out of our minds, but that was seen as very important. And so Sarah was unable to conceive, and so she thought, well, take my servant and have a child with her, so you can raise up offspring. But when that took place, and when she did conceive, Sarah there was enmity between her and Hagar, and ultimately Hagar was driven away, and Abraham dismissed her. And we see how we won't talk about it, but God also protected Hagar in that harsh treatment. But Abraham and Sarah, that was kind of seen as they faltered, especially Sarah. She faltered in trusting in the Lord, and so that was like a kind of, and St. Paul himself sees this very allegorically, right? Hagar was a slave, an Egyptian slave, bearing a child out of not through the promise of God, but just out of necessity. While Sarah, the free woman, ultimately bore a child, Isaac, who would be the father of many nations. And so again, this is a lesson for us about the Old Testament does present us with a married couple, well, men that had multiple wives, David, Solomon, and many others, but that does not mean that polygamy was encouraged, or that it was shown as somehow the norm. And you'll actually see that we'll talk about a bit more, but in all the cases in the Old Testament where there's polygamous marriages, there's always trouble, there's always strife. And this is something the biblical narrative is teaching us, is that from the beginning, God did not pull three women out of Adam's side. No? He pulled one, right? Which means this is how it should be. And we see how Jesus Christ himself will re-establish that rather. So let's continue. Then, of course, we have Isaac, the child of the promise that was born of Sarah. And this couple is really the ideal couple in the Old Testament. That's also why you hear Isaac's name being mentioned so many times in the Isaac and Rebekah are mentioned so many times in the marriage service, the crowning service of the Orthodox Church. Isaac and Rebekah are mentioned probably the most. And interestingly, Isaac had one wife, Rebekah, right? So again, when we see this take place, and he loved her from the very beginning, and she loved him, there's a beautiful, part of the Genesis. So we remember we spoke about this last time. Eliezer went to go find a wife for Isaac. Right? Abraham sent his servant to go find a wife from his homeland, so she came from his kindred. And Eliezer means God is my help. So they asked God's help to find a wife. Then when she's on her way to see Isaac, Isaac is working in the field. So he's laboring, preparing for his bride. Already there's a lesson there. He's not just hanging around like a brat saying, "Where's my bride?" He's working. He's working in the field. And Rebekah sees this man working while she's on her way back. She said to the servant, this is now in Genesis, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "He is my master," which means it's Isaac. And then it says, then she took her veil and covered herself. And so Rebekah beautifully dismounted off her, I think it was camel or whatever, and veiled herself when she went to go meet Isaac. And interestingly, in the Jewish marriage, even to this day, this has formed part of the ritual, where a bride will veil herself when she comes to her husband, which is interesting. We used to the other way sometimes in the Western tradition, where the bride unveils herself. And I would say there's a big lesson for this. When she comes to meet her husband to be, she begins to humble herself. She doesn't want to, now I think the modern female approach is when you see a guy you like, you start taking stuff off to get more attention. Unfortunately, that seems to be the case. While in the biblical, the ideal way, the woman veils even more, humbles herself. And ultimately Isaac and Rebekah became this couple that loved one another and had a fruitful marriage. So there's a lesson that we can learn from. One thing I wanted to say is that in the Old Testament, we don't really read about formal ceremonies and rites, marriage rites like we know them today, because the marriage itself, the consummation of the marriage, was the kind of the ritual, was the sign that they had become one flesh. And so of course there were things that happened. There would be families would meet, and there would be probably celebrations and all these things, but it wasn't as legalistic and formal as we understand marriage today, okay, in the kind of legal sense. Jacob and Rachel, we know the story well. I wanted to mention some of the beautiful things, of course, about Jacob is his labor for love, right? We know the story. His father-in-law tricked him, made him labor for 7 years to find the woman, he loved Rachel. He adored and loved her. This is one of the stories of love at first sight. Okay, so he loved her from first sight. And that's not the case with every couple, by the way, that we read about. But he labored for her, but then he was tricked by his father-in-law, and he married him to his other daughter, who he didn't love as much. And so then he had to labor another 7 years in order that he would receive Rachel. And he did this, and there's a lot of beautiful allegorical lessons. Even St. Andrew of Crete speaks about the two wives of Jacob being, action and contemplation. That we first must act, and then we come into a deeper stage of meditation. So he had to labor for many years, double what he expected, in order to receive his true love. So again, this is something, an important example for us that and I think we fall into this trap with couples. We want immediate gratification. We want everything now. We don't want to struggle to get there. And because we don't struggle to get there, we don't appreciate marriage as much, because, as we spoke about last time, people cohabitate immediately. They live a married life before they've really struggled for it. And when easy come, easy go. If we labor for something, when we receive it, we cherish it and we hold on to it. And so we shouldn't run away from laboring for marriage and laboring to get there. That should be every young man that wants to get married. That should be his motivation when he works, is to labor that he could marry and provide. And every woman as well should labor that she would become a good wife and be able to have strength to raise children and run a household. So we shouldn't be afraid of this kind of struggle. Okay. I'm finding all the sweet paintings of the couples. Okay. Sorry, this one's got a watermark, but anyway. And then so there's many couples in the Old Testament. So I didn't have time to look at them all, but I just wanted to mention some names. So of course, one of the famous ones, it has a whole book. The book of Ruth is dedicated to the story of Boaz and Ruth. The book is called Ruth. Basically, the story goes like this. Naomi had two Jewish sons, who married a Moabite woman, Orpah and Ruth. And they died in battle, or I can't remember. But they passed away, and they left two widows, basically. And their mother was also a widow. And so Naomi went back to the land of her people, and she told Ruth and Orpah, you can go back to the Moabites. You don't have to come with me, because your husbands are dead, so you're no longer bound to them. And Orpah left back, but Ruth went with her mother-in-law, and she went. Two women that were destitute basically went back, living on the fringes of society, and they happened to labor in the field of Boaz. And Boaz was a righteous man, and ultimately Ruth found his attention, and Boaz took Ruth under his protection, and he married her. So this is another beautiful image of marriage that we can learn from. Now, to Boaz, this Moabite woman that was unmarried, he could have abused her, he could have used her, absolutely, because she was very vulnerable. They were just surviving by, when the men were harvesting, they would walk behind them and take a little bit of grain that they dropped, which was part of the Levitical laws that allowed people who were destitute to kind of forage. And she labored there, and Boaz did the right thing. He did the righteous thing, where he took her not just as a concubine or took her as a side girlfriend. He married her, and he incorporated her into his family, and she became, and the famous words she said, your people are my people, I think it is, yeah. And
Father?
Yes?
There's a question from Nina.
Yes, sorry, my sound was down. Please ask a question.
Hello, I would like to ask a question.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, I struggle to read the Bible and I use the New Testament, the New King James Version audio for the New Testament so I can keep track of the New Testament, but there isn't a Septuagint Old Testament audio for the Orthodox Style Bible. How can I read and focus on the Bible more?
Maybe start with the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is not so long, and it's like a story in its structure. And you can probably find good Old Testament recordings. Maybe not the New King James Version, or maybe not Septuagint, but still, generally reliable. So look up Old Testament audio. Another interesting resource I would recommend is I forgot the name now, but it's YouTube videos about each book. It's called the Bible. No, not Bible Illustrated. I'll send the link, but basically they give an overview of every book. It's not Orthodox authors, but still very recommended. Just to give a general overview of every book. And if you watch that and then you go and read the book, it helps you kind of focus. So, but we should really try read the scriptures as much as we can and learn these stories. They're really beautiful, but we have to kind of stay focused. So you can use any audio of the Old Testament that you can find, as long as not some crazy fringe like Mormon translation or something.
Yeah, but isn't there like a Orthodox Style Bible audiobook or anything like that?
I'm not sure. I'll have to check it out. So I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you for the Nicholas.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Are there any other questions? I heard a little sound. So, look at the fruit of Ruth's marriage with Boaz. She is the grandmother of King David. Boaz was not afraid of a divorced woman. He took her in, and he had raised up a family from her. He took the risk of, he's marrying a Moabite woman, an outsider. And they're one of the best examples of a successful marriage. So again, and in fact, Boaz is seen as an image of Christ, and Ruth is an image of the Gentiles. So Christ himself, and we'll go in now into Christ as actually the best example for marriage. He did this when the new covenant is not just for the Jews. He opened it all for the whole world, and he accepted into his holy church all peoples, just like Boaz received Ruth as the Moabite woman into his household. So yeah. Okay, but there's also bad things that happen in marriages in the Old Testament. Probably one of the most famous ones is Solomon. Now, Solomon is still understood as one of the great righteous of the Old Testament. We should remember the scriptures were not shy to show us the flaws of the heroes in the books, because God is the ultimate hero in the Bible. God is the hero, and the figures that we read about, they were struggling towards salvation, right? So Solomon was wise in how he ordered his kingdom, how he built the temple. That was where his wisdom really was established. Yet in his older age, he faltered. And I'm going to read this is from 1 Kings 11. And you'll understand his problem. King Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to the Pharaoh's daughter. So he first married Pharaoh's daughter, but then he loved many foreign women. He loved Hittite women and women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sidon. They came from the nations about which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, never intermarry with them. They will surely tempt you to follow their gods. But Solomon was obsessed with their love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 wives who were concubines. In his old age, his wives tempted him to follow their gods. He was no longer committed to the Lord his God, and as his father David had been. Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the disgusting idol of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what the Lord considered evil. He did not wholeheartedly follow the Lord as his father David had done. So it's interesting. Now, again, this was not necessarily just Solomon. It says he loved, he was obsessed with their love. So yes, he enjoyed having this harem of wives, and he was presiding over this very important, small but very important kingdom that was the crossroads between all the great kingdoms, right? Israel, the United Kingdom still under Solomon had the Egyptians in the southwest. It had the Hittites in the north, Babylonians in the east. And so what he did was he married these women also as kind of political, pragmatic decisions, because by marrying a princess from every nation, or a couple, it seems, he would establish diplomatic ties. So Solomon was being very pragmatic and obviously having lots of benefits with that. But by doing that, he invited their gods. These women were not accepting his faith, right? He had established a temple. He had built a temple that his father, David, wished to do, had longed to do, yet because of David's sin, he could not. So God gave it to Solomon to do. And that temple was built for one God only, the true God, Yahweh. And now what happened was in the city of David, in Jerusalem, right, the capital, he had begun to allow his wives to set up altars to their gods. And so he had begun to defile the city, which was dedicated to God alone. And so there is a danger here. Solomon was being too pragmatic. Let's not be too pragmatic in our marriages. It's not just what's going to be good for us. There has to be a higher purpose in our marriages. And ideally, what Solomon should have been doing was bringing these wives in and sharing the true God, teaching them about the true God. He was able to, for example, who can tell me with who had the true faith? We're not sure if it was his wife, but most people think so. Who came to Solomon and left as believing in Yahweh? Can anyone tell me? She was a queen from where? Oh, maybe have I lost you guys? Or does no one want to say anything?
Are you talking about Queen of Sheba?
Yeah. So even the Jewish people, the Ethiopians have a Jewish heritage. And this began already in that time when the Queen of Sheba heard of the wisdom of Solomon, and that's what she was looking for. She brought gold and ivory and things from Africa, and he imparted to her his wisdom. And so that was a proper exchange. And she left and brought that faith of the true God, which ultimately prepared the Ethiopian people to receive Christ. Right. So very interesting. So this is obviously a great example of polygamy, how it can cause problems. And so Solomon accepted these wives, and they brought the temptations that come along with that, with their false beliefs. Okay. Another example of the problems with polygamy was with David himself, King David. King David also had many wives, and he also had concubines, which is basically it's like servants who, I don't want to use the word sex slaves because that's not necessarily what it was, but it's like women who served in your household that would you'd have sexual relationships with. It wasn't non-consensual or things like that. But he had concubines, and we immediately see David, the downfall of his family was all related to his polygamy, and the downfall of his kingdom even was, so the most kind of like terrible part was when Absalom, his son, took over the city, and he took the 10 concubines of David. It's quite a rough story, but and what they do is he speaks to Ahithophel and says, give your advice. What should I do now that I want to establish myself as the king? David, he drove his father away. So his own son drove his father away into the wilderness, and now is setting himself as the new ruler. And he says, go and have relations with your father's concubines, whom he has left behind to take care of the house. And do it in front of everyone, so people will see you have kind of like taken control of his household. And so he does this in public, like on the rooftops, like in a tent. He pitched a tent, and so that the people would see, oh, now Absalom has taken the concubines of David, and various other things like that. And so there was this immense family strife, and it all begins with this David not having one faithful, beloved wife that he was dedicated to. So what does this mean to us? Well, of course, generally we don't have this type of lifestyle, but we actually do in our mind, in our thoughts, with men and women in the modern world, where we our eyes wander. Men are not faithful even with their eyes. And this is the beginning of the breakdown of relationships, when we don't have this dedication to radical monogamy. And this is something that Christ again reestablished very clearly, and we'll speak about it a bit later. But so part of that is keeping our eyes and our hearts not inviting lust for many others into our hearts. Of course, the thing that comes to mind is pornography. Pornography is so prevalent in the world today among men and women, and this is studies have shown it's absolutely totally destructive to engage in pornography, because men are viewing multiple women, just like having a harem or something like this, and they no longer have this desire to be faithful and to dedicate their eyes and their whole being to one person. And so unfortunately, this is still and then it brings the downfall of marriages, because men and women no longer know what it means to be faithful. They've hypersexualized themselves and their understanding of what marriage is or what a relationship is. And so we have to be very careful of this. And we see the examples from the Old Testament, how this is what's absolutely destroyed the families of these great righteous men even. Okay. This is my favorite painting when I was an art student. This is, who can tell me, what is this depicting? This is another infamous couple of the Old Testament. What's happening here? Can anyone tell me?
Is it Samson and Delilah?
Yeah, that's the one. It's painted by Solomon R. Solomon. He was one of the famous 19th century painters, not very known now. But, oh, she just looks so evil. What is she waving there? She's waving Samson's hair. Delilah is waving Samson's hair. She got him. This was like the toxic relationship of the Old Testament, basically. Because Samson, we know he was a handsome, strong man. Many women desired him. He was very arrogant. Meanwhile, his parents had dedicated him to God. He was meant to be like a Nazarene, not drinking wine, not cutting his hair, and that was where his true strength was. You see, it's not actually it wasn't his physical strength; it was his anointing from God, and his long hair represented that. and yet he fell in love with this foreign Philistine woman. She was obviously very desirable, beautiful. The Philistines, picked the most beautiful one, but she was basically tempting him to take his power away so she could. Well, she obviously had some benefits. She was given things by the Philistines for this. And he kept on, and she did this. She tried this multiple times where we would ask him, what's the secret of your strength? And then he would tell us something false, like, you must tie me up with this particular sinew or whatever. And then she would tell the Philistines, and he would kind of forgive her or ignore it. And she kept on pushing at him until he gave in to her. Now, he was obviously driven by, and the church fathers speak about this, Samson was driven by his lusts. And that was part of his weakness, is he was driven by his lust for Delilah. And she was driven by her lust for power. So they were using each other, basically. That's like the ultimate toxic thing. And that's how Samson was deceived and ultimately defeated. And it was only in his repentance, being blinded and kept as a kind of slave in the temple, where he slowly began to make right with God. But that took much long repentance and celibacy, in a way, losing of his passions. So there's the Bible has a lot of stories that we should really look at and see, are we being driven by this desire when we have a partner? The sad thing is, from both sides. So for a lot of women, especially women who have been in previous relationships, maybe a few previous failed relationships, they begin to be very pragmatic and say, well, now I don't really care about falling in love. Now I want someone who's going to give me something. And they will basically use use the passions of the other person to get them, right? So this is what a temptress is, right? And so we should not allow any of these kind of things to come near to us preparing for marriage, right? If someone is playing those kind of games, we should really stay away. Okay, we always study this nice, this movement, of the figures. Very clever way the artist has used all this dynamic diagonals and curves and things. Anyway, that's the art lesson for next time. Who can guess? Okay, sorry, there's text, but don't look at the text. Who can guess what failure this is? So there's a young bride here. You can guess we're in Egypt. What's happening here? This was another failure in the Old Testament in a marriage.
Sorry, Father, I actually did look at the text, but
Okay, yeah, tell us.
yeah,
Okay,
it's basically Abraham telling that his wife is his sister rather than his wife, and Abraham
Yeah.
almost taking her for himself.
Yeah.
Or
So
yeah.
yeah, I found this very interesting painting. I really like it. It's got these kind of like frumpy Egyptians looking at this interesting, this very, very unhappy bride, which is Sarah. What happened was there was a famine, and so Abraham went into Egypt with Sarah, his wife. But Abraham was scared. He was scared of the Egyptians, and also he knew that Sarah was beautiful. And this is now when they're younger. And he said to her, "I know you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, 'This is his wife.' Then they'll kill me, but let you live. So please say that you're my sister. Then everything will be all right for me, and because of you, I will live." It was his this was Abraham's selfish moment, where he's not being honorable, he's not honoring his wife, he's using his wife and saying, well, they're going to kill me, I don't want to die, so I want everything to be all right with me. And so he does this. Luckily, of course, God intervenes and brings calamity to Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh actually confronts Abraham and says, how could you have given me your wife and bring judgment upon me? I thought it was your sister. But there's a big lesson here. First of all, Sarah didn't, after this event, Sarah didn't just walk up and leave him and be like, how could you do that to me? They obviously made peace. And Sarah, in fact, went through with it for the love of her husband. And Abraham made a mistake, and yet they remained together, and he remained faithful to Sarah all those years. So it's a failure, but it's also a lesson for us to see that although there can be mistakes in a marriage, especially in the beginning, we should be able to forgive one another and continue to carry on. That everyone, even Abraham, had his weaknesses, right? So yeah. So behold, the bridegroom comes. Jesus Christ comes in the chaos of the world and the broken marriages that we see in the Old Testament. Some, of course, were glimmers of paradise. Isaac and Rebecca, other couples like Joseph and Asenath, etc., etc. Boaz and Ruth. Yes, there were glimmers of paradise, glimmers of good things, but many, many examples of bad things and many misconceptions about marriage. And so Jesus Christ comes, and although Jesus never actually married someone, didn't begin family life and things like this, but he did still come as a bridegroom. Of course, one of the images of that is when he comes to see the Samaritan woman at the well. It's no coincidence that his dialogue with her is about her previous marriages. How she had 5 husbands, and the man that she's with is not even her husband. So she was unable to be faithful, unable to be monogamous, and remain a wife. And Jesus comes and sits with her at a well, which is the place where in the Old Testament husbands and wives met. I'm always thinking, we should have a beautiful well somewhere around the church, and that can be where the couple should meet, because it's very biblical. And that can be a little hint. If you go to the well, you're looking for a husband, because that was the place where boys and girls would meet generally, is to gather water. Women would go. Also, if you wanted to meet a girl in the ancient world, in the Middle East or the Near East, you'd go to the well, because all the women would fetch water every day. So if there was a girl you liked in the village, you'd just go wait at the well, and then you'd find her there sometime during the day. So it was the kind of like the meeting spot. And so Jesus comes and meets his bride, is the sinful Samaritan woman who is unfaithful, unable to understand what true marriage is, and she sits before Christ, who is the perfect example of faithfulness, of love, of sacrificial love, and he accepts the Samaritan woman, and he receives her, and he shares the kingdom with her. And this little meeting becomes a kind of image of how Christ marries himself to the fallen world that has been unfaithful to him, to God, and yet he still wants to love us, to dedicate his life to us like a true husband, right? And so not only does Jesus do this, he accepts our fallen nature and our brokenness, but he also calls us back to the original version of marriage that God ordained in the beginning. And this is even clearly said in his dialogue with the Pharisees. So I'll read it for you. I can't remember. I think this is from Luke's Gospel, but I could be wrong. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, so now Jesus, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh?" The two, not the one man and his concubines. "So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." Right? We know that it's from on the movies in the wedding service. And they said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away?" And he said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And his disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, is it better not to marry?" So, very strict words from Christ. What he's doing is he's reestablishing what marriage is. Now, we have to look at the context here. In the time of Jesus, divorce was a very easy process. If a man wanted to divorce his wife, he had to just get a written slip, basically, and that would be that. Of course, there'd be some procedures and inquiries and things, and they'd have to pay like a dowry and some maintenance, I suppose you'd call it. But in general, divorce had become quite a common thing, and nothing it was seen as nothing bad about it, because, well, it's in the law. Moses allowed for divorce, but Jesus corrects them and says he only did it because of the hardness of your hearts, that you were not prepared to be dedicated to one person. But it was not like that from the beginning. And so Jesus calls us to be like it was from the beginning. And here begins the ideal of Christian marriage. Christian marriage is radical monogamy. And the disciples couldn't understand this. That's why they said, maybe we shouldn't marry at all, because to them marriage wasn't so binding. Marriage wasn't so radical. But really, that is what the church is calling us to, because as rational spiritual beings, we have to practice immense faithfulness that is not pragmatic in any way. And we're going to look at some of the lives of the saints to show these examples, this example of radical faithfulness, radical love, that shows a higher manner of living, a spiritual manner of living, that a married couple should attain. Just as Jesus Christ, he was the most dedicated husband to the whole world, right? The Messiah is like a bridegroom. He loved us till the end, even when we didn't love him back. This is a nice little Coptic icon of the wedding at Cana. I kind of like it. Jesus' first miracle in John's Gospel was blessing the wedding and turning the water into wine. Marriage brings joy. Marriage is the image of the kingdom to come. Marriages turns the mundane into something substantial, something elevated. This is what he's showing us by this miracle. But Christ wouldn't do that if he thought marriage wasn't a sacrament, wasn't something that is a mystery that God has ordained, and not just a human creation or something. Okay. So let's look at how are we doing for time? Okay, we kind of at time, but I won't hop on too long with some of these couples. But we see already from the beginning, Christians, after the resurrection, the ascension of Christ through the Holy Spirit is guiding the church, guiding the apostles. Some of the apostles are still married and they didn't divorce their wives. Of course, some of them totally dedicated their lives to mission work, and so their married life, as they probably knew it, ended. But others, apostles like Philip, for example, preached with his daughters in Hierapolis, I think it was, and other places. So some of the apostles remained married. So marriage was not something that was done away with or seen as like not necessary. Marriage was kept in the Orthodox Church and the early Christians, and it began to become elevated as people understood and were inspired by the Holy Spirit, the wonderful calling of marriage. Now, there were some sects, like groups like Gnostics and other groups that saw marriage as kind of like an evil thing. It had to be kind of, we had to just kind of deal with it, but it's not something that's part of God's plan. But these were seen as heresies. And early Christians elevated marriage, and the married life was one of the ways in which Christians could work out their salvation. And we see this with Aquila and Priscilla, who are mentioned by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, and he calls them fellow workers in Christ. They also were tent makers, and they opened their ministry, their life for the church, and we don't know much about them. Priscilla was probably a deaconess. And what else can we say about them? Yeah, they were like a power couple. We see the house churches in the New Testament. The house churches were often a house of a family was given to the church to use for worship. So the people would come and worship in their dining room, and they would minister to the people. And so this is definitely the case with Aquila and Priscilla. And so you see how a household can expand its family now. The spiritual children of Aquila and Priscilla expanded, and so they were using their this combined strength and resources to continue ministering in the church. What else do I want to say about this? No, let's continue. Another thing we see among the early Christian saints is that they encourage one another to holiness. So you see how things have shifted already from the Old Testament. Marriage is sometimes we see good glimmers, but here already in the New Testament, in the new age of the Holy Spirit, that married couples are not only radically monogamous, but they're even pulling each other, tempting each other to holiness. And one such example is the story of Saint Adrian and Natalia. Adrian was married to Natalia, who was a secret Christian. This was often the case in the very early centuries. There was mixed marriages where one person would convert in secret and others would remain a pagan, and this was the case with Adrian. But Adrian was serving under the Emperor Maximian, and he noticed he was presiding over the persecution of Christians, and he saw how brave they were and how they were awaiting something greater in this life, which than this life, and that's why they were willing to die as martyrs. And this inspired him so much that he himself professed his Christianity. And when he did this, he obviously was also arrested and thrown into prison. And when Natalia found this out, she didn't say, just renounce your faith and come back to me. It's going to be, I don't want to lose a husband. She encouraged him and said, yes, you must be faithful. And what happened was the emperor actually released Adrian and gave him a date in which he would be executed, to kind of try and make him recant and renounce Christ. And he sent him home for a few days until he would be executed. And when Adrian went to knock on the door, this is what this interesting icon is about. When Adrian went to knock on the door, Natalia wouldn't let him in. She said, no, if you've denounced Christ. She thought he had denounced Christ. That's why he was still alive and coming. And she didn't want to open to him. But then when she found out what had happened, she kept on strengthening his faith and his courage that he would ultimately die as a martyr, which he did. And so they both considered martyrs, because she died. Her martyrdom was seeing her husband executed. And he gave his life for Christ. So amazing, absolutely not pragmatic in any way, right? It didn't help her anyway to become a widow, yet she encouraged her husband to strive for perfection of faith. Okay. Another really interesting saint, Saint Ahmed the calligrapher. So now we fast forward more than 1,000 years to modern day Istanbul, really, Constantinople. There was an official in the Ottoman Empire called Ahmed, and he had 2 Russian slaves, female slaves, a concubine and an old woman, both Russian. So this was often the case in this period because there was Russia-Turkish wars, and the populations were exchanging, and there were often slaves taken from the Slavs, in fact, in the Ottoman Empire. So he had 2 Russian slaves. One of them was his female companion slave, if you want to say it like that. So let me read the story for you. So Ahmed owned 2 Russian slaves, a concubine and an old woman, whom he allowed to attend one of the Greek Orthodox churches in Constantinople. In time, Ahmed began to notice that when his pious Russian slaves returned from church, they were far more gracious and loving than they were before going. Intrigued by this, Ahmed obtained permission to attend by the Ecumenical Patriarch celebration of the Divine Liturgy in Constantinople. And due to his status and identity, his request was not refused, and he was given a discreet place at the church. During the Divine Liturgy, Ahmed saw that when the Ecumenical Patriarch blessed the faithful with his trikiri, so his 3 candles, like the bishop does, and dikiri, his fingers beamed light onto the heads of the faithful Christians, but not his own. Amazed by this miracle, Ahmed requested and received holy baptism. And whatever happened during this period, one day a group of arguing officials asked Ahmed for his opinion of their dispute, to which he replied that there is nothing better than the Christian faith. And for this he was put before the Sultan Mehmed IV and Qadi, and after torture and a few chances to return to Islam, he was subsequently beheaded on the 3rd of May, 1682. So how interesting. This is now the question about couples that don't have the same faith, maybe, but that's not ideal. But maybe one is a bit more zealous than the other, right? This Russian, I can't remember if her name was mentioned, but this Russian concubine, she asked permission to go to church. So first of all, she didn't just abandon her Christian faith; she remained faithful to Christ. And all it took was to intrigue Ahmed, Saint Ahmed, was that when his concubine went to church, and when she returned, she was of a better demeanor. She was more, obviously, she was refreshed and kinder and better, and he could see a real change in this person after they had attended prayer. And that was the key that made him say, I want to see what's happening at this Divine Liturgy. And then he himself became a witness to God's power in the church. And ultimately he became a martyr, which is why he's a saint. But let that be our best way to bring others to the faith. Let them see the change in us. If you have a spouse or a fiancé that is not as zealous or not interested in the faith, it's not worth trying to preach to them. That's not going to work. Be transfigured, be changed. And when they see the change, it's undeniable. They have to respond to that. And I hear it many times when people say, yeah, I don't really agree with his or her faith, but I can definitely see something's changing in them, so it's not a bad thing. And immediately that's wonderful to see that. So let that be encouragement to any of you who have that situation. Okay. 1 or 2 more stories, and then we can go to questions. Another amazing thing in the Christian witness and the Christian experience is faithfulness. Faithfulness to the end. This is the ideal in Christianity. That is why, for example, even in the canons of like the priesthood, the priest is not allowed to cannot be a husband of more than 1 wife. This is in the scriptures. But for example, if a man wants to be a priest and remain a priest, he can only have one wife ever. So he can't have been married multiple times. Even if his wife dies, he's not meant to remarry. That is the ideal, and so we should strive towards that. And one person that did, one very holy woman, was Saint Ksenia of St. Petersburg. She lived in the 18th century. We don't know much about her life and her family. She probably didn't have children yet. She lived during the time of Catherine II. But she was the wife to an army officer, Major Andrew Petrov. And they lived in St. Petersburg, but she became a widow at the young age of 26. Her husband died probably from a heart attack at a party, like a dinner party. And she immediately began to grieve the loss of her husband. And especially she did because he didn't die with confession or receiving the sacraments. So he had not died having repented of his sins and come to full faith, let's just say. And I'll read the last bit because I think it's written very beautifully. Once her earthly happiness ended, she did not look for it again. And from that time forward, Ksenia lost interest in the things of this world and followed the difficult path of foolishness for the sake of Christ. The basis for this strange way of life is to be found in 1st Epistle to Corinthians. We can read that later. But the Lord strengthened her and helped her to bear sorrow and misfortune patiently for the next 45 years. So she remained a widow for 45 years. She started wearing her husband's clothing and insisted that she be addressed as Andrew Fyodorovich. She told people, so that's her husband's name, and she told people that it was she and not her husband who had died. And in a certain sense, this was perfectly true. So she took on her husband's, and she repented and lived a holy life for him as well. She loved him so much that she remained faithful to him even after his death. And she becomes, and it's interesting, she is the patron saint for many young couples or people looking for a spouse. Saint Ksenia has blessed many people. Many people give witness that through her intercession they found their partner. So, anyone looking, ask Ksenia. Okay, a couple of other mentions. Peter and Fevronia, the Romeo and Juliet of medieval Russia, basically. A short story. Peter was sick. He had type of leprosy, and finally he ended up being healed by a beekeeper's daughter. And they felt, they were in love. They were dedicated to one another. But she was a peasant. He married Peter, and this made and he was a prince. Peter was a prince of Murom. And when his brother died and he was supposed to rule Murom, which is a medieval city of Russia, you can still go there today. It's still a beautiful city. And they didn't want to accept Fevronia because she was like a peasant. How can we be ruled by a peasant woman as our princess or queen, if you would say? And so they said to Peter, no, you must get rid of that woman and get a proper noble wife. And Peter said, no, sorry, I will not leave my wife. And he abdicated. He left he left the throne for his wife. And then chaos broke out in Murom, and they invited them back, and the people humbled themselves. And Peter and Fevronia ruled Murom, very righteously, and they were a perfect example of patient love for one another. But even so, they chose the monastic life later on, and Peter became David, and Fevronia became Ephrasinia. And the interesting thing is that they lived in separate monasteries, but they died on the same day. And the people saw that as that they had come so close to one another that even they died on the same day. And ultimately, they were buried in the same coffin together. So even as monastics, so they become this beautiful image of faithfulness and to one another. Here's some nice. So it's very important feast in Russia now for the Orthodox Christians, not for everyone, because this is such a problem in the world. In Russia, is faithfulness. It's a disease that is really unfortunately found its way there. And so Peter and Fevronia have really been a resurrection of the value of faithfulness to one another. So we see these monuments built towards them, and it's now celebrated in Russia as the day of can someone tell me what is the day called in Russia? Как называется этот день?
Ну, просто Петра и Февронии, разве нет?
Это не день верности и любви. or something?
Не
День
помню.
семьи, любви и верности.
Thank you. Can you translate that?
Day of family. Как я сказала? Я забыла.
The day of family,
Family,
faithfulness, верности, и
ага. And love.
and love. Yeah. So it's a beautiful a day, and it's important for us to celebrate it, especially for children to see that that's an ideal, because now children don't see that. Their heroes are, I don't even know who their heroes anymore. Their heroes are like weird AI creatures or something, at least my kids. So we need to really show people this ideal and that it's possible. And that's why we love Peter and Fevronia. Okay, and one last thing about marriage. Now, many amazing couples like St. John of Kronstadt and his Majorska, I think it was Elisaveta, they never had children, yet their marriage was beautiful and perfect. So, but generally, and this is wonderful. And as St. John Chrysostom says, he mentions that that's not the ultimate purpose of marriage is for the salvation of the husband and wife and for their bond. And children are not essential for that. But of course, children are a natural thing that comes from a marriage that we should not hinder. Right? And so part of a marriage is the building of a family. And this is even reflected in the prayers of the crowning service. So this is from the Orthodox crowning service. Grant them of the fruit of their bodies, fair children, concord of soul and body. Exalt them like the cedars of Lebanon, like a luxuriant vine. Give them offspring in number like unto full ears of grain, so that having enough of all things, they may abound in every work that is good and acceptable unto thee. In thy sight they may shine like the stars of heaven in thee, O our God. So beautiful ideal that marriages should be fruitful and should produce wonderful children, and that this household shall be filled with all good things, so that every good work that is acceptable to God may be multiplied. And so ideally in Orthodox marriages we should have children. So in the modern idea, a lot of you hear people say we want to get married but we definitely don't want kids. That is doesn't make sense in the Orthodox perspective, because children are a blessing. We build families and we increase and multiply the kingdom of God. Every saint we know had a mother and father. He didn't come out of nothing. Came from a family. And what you'll notice is some of the great saints came from families of saints. The famous is Saint Emilia, and who had Saint Basil, Macrina, Gregory, many saints from the same family. And so we shouldn't run away from this. And this is something that we should be very clear about if we find when we're in marriage. Do we want children, and how are we going to make this happen? How are we going to provide for them, and all these things to be part of that? Okay. Let's finish off. Sorry, it was a long one tonight. Who likes to read? Can someone read St. Paisios' last words for us before we wrap up tonight? Would anyone like to read this?
I can
Yeah, sure, I can
volunteer.
read.
Who said it first? Tanya.
Yeah, go for it.
Tanya. Okay, so this is someone asking, Geronta means elder in Greek, asking Saint Paisios about how do people mature, grow and mature with love. Okay, so thank you, Tanya.
Yeronda, you once told us that people grow and mature with love. It isn't enough to merely love another. We must love the other more than ourselves. A mother loves her children more than she loves herself. She will stay hungry to feed her children, yet she feels greater pleasure than they do. The children are fed materially, but she is fed spiritually. They experience the taste of food while she experiences spiritual rejoicing. A young girl before she marries may sleep until 10 in the morning and have her breakfast prepared by her mother. She may be too lazy to do even the slightest chores. She wants everything at her back and cool. She has expectations from her mother, expectations from her father, while she sits at her ease. And although she is capable of loving, this ability isn't developed because she is constantly receiving help and blessings from her mother, her father, and her siblings. However, from the moment she becomes a mother, she resembles a little engine that the harder it works, the more it is recharged, because love works constantly. Before she hated to touch anything unclean, she used aromatic soaps to wash herself. But after she becomes a mother, when you see how she cleans her soiled child, oh, you would think she's touching marmalade. She's not repulsed by anything. Before, if she was woken up early, she yelled because she was annoyed. Once she becomes a mother, when her child cries, she stays up all night without complaint. She rejoices in taking care of her child. Why? For she is no longer a child. She became a mother, sacrifice and love have come into her life.
Thank you, Tanya. So, Paisios is very rightly saying, part of marriage gives us this opportunity to come out of our infantile state and to sacrifice, to become a little engine of love that is constantly working for the other, not for ourselves. Let's not first, we often want to work for ourselves, serve ourselves. But marriage is the opportunity where we learn to love the other, and I love the idea, the mother goes hungry, but she's actually fed spiritually. So in marriage, we go without certain things, but we can't spend our money on ourselves anymore, spoiling ourselves with, extravagant things, because we have to put it into the family. So we go hungry, let's just say, but spiritually we grow. And I think this is why marriage is so important. Marriage is part of our salvation, as we said in the beginning. We see how that is definitely the case, and building a family, children are also part of that. So I think let's wrap it up there. Are there any questions or comments? I'll stop the slideshow. Is it like this? Oh, yeah. There we go.
Father, I just wanted to say, like with the previous one, it's a very lovely topic, and I find that when it comes to marriage, our Christian perspective on it is so lovely in comparison to what we see out there these days.
Absolutely, yeah. It's difficult, and next week we will speak about divorce and about the brokenness of marriage and how to deal with it, because there are many saints who came from divorced situations, and they were able to pick up the pieces and still make their life holy. So we will speak about that. But absolutely, the Christian ideal, the Christian calling is a spiritual, as we said in the prayer opening tonight, a spiritual manner of living. Our marriages are spiritual. They are not just pragmatic. They are a calling to become truly human. So and let's strive for that. It's worth having a marriage like that than having one that is held together by very, very thin threads that easily break. But if we're held together by love, the love of Christ, Christ's love is unbreakable. So when our marriages break, it's because we've let go of the chain, the powerful robe of Christ's love, which is unbreakable. So if we hold on to that, then our marriages will stay together. Any questions? Нет вопросов? Nothing?
Father,
Yes,
I just a quick comment, because I've recently gone through Abraham's story, and it was just cool, the pattern that is repeated throughout many of the stories in the Bible, where we see something we desire, and then we try to take it for ourselves, like Eve taking the apple, right? So Sarah wants a child, and instead of asking God and trusting that he will give to her what she needs for her salvation, she goes to Abraham and tells him to provide her with a child, and then everything falls apart. Then she regrets what happens. So instead of trying to take what we desire, we should trust that the Lord will provide what's necessary for our salvation.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. There's an interesting thing in the Old Testament. We see that in a lot of these marriages, there's like the wife of their youth, the wife of their beloved, and that really just by being faithful to that one, despite them being barren or despite whatever challenges, that is what they're called to do. And everything else, every other bride or wife that comes in, it's all very, very symbolic, and there's a pattern there. It's all like pulling them away from that. And that's why in Christian marriage, it's, like, I think that's a good point. Like when we are blessed to be married to someone, okay? And we see that as a gift from God and not just like, oh, I got this, I took what I wanted, right? Then it's very, I think it's the marriage is really can remain strong and faithful, because you don't not seeing this person as something you just took because you liked it and maybe you stop liking it, but you see it as a gift from God, and you think, wow, I should be really grateful that I'm married and that I've been given this blessing to make this relationship blossom into something like holy. And when you see it like that, it's not an object of desire, but it's humbly provided to us by God. And that's most people's marriages in the ancient world were provided to them, so they were like arranged in a sense. Not always, but that was like quite common. And then the most important part of that equation was that the couple should accept that and love the wife of their youth always. The Proverbs speak about that as well. Absolutely, I think it's a good observation. Any other comments? Okay. Yeah, it's been a long one. Thank you,
Father
everyone.
Nicholas, sorry.
Yes, Alexandra. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question actually. I want to ask, but maybe it's like more personally the question. I mean, because you have a Matushka, right, for many years, and I'm just wondering, can you tell us maybe 5 or 10 just main principles of long and happy Christian marriage? It's wonderful. I want to know maybe some secrets or something, that makes you long term together. It's
So yeah, we've been together for some time, and I would say that maybe there's some personal things. I'll think of something, but on Matushka's side, I think a lot of the work is on that side, because Matushka entered into we married each other. We were definitely attracted to each other, and I was much more romantic then than I am now. But what has held us together, I would say that I tell people this a lot. I think we had similar values, so we valued the same things what was good, and that was based on our common Christian faith. Okay. But then we also had we worked towards common goals. So our marriage was always optiedele, like it was always like common work. Like we were always working towards, and sometimes and that's not always so clear. So sometimes it was what I wanted, but she would then follow my my wish and then support me in that, and then that would inspire me to support what she wanted. So I think to find a common values and common goals, that helps marriage a lot, and it gets your mind off of the obsession with like romantic love, because I think a lot of times we get tricked by the modern ideal, which is like the perfect marriage is like full of, you know, chocolate boxes and flowers and constant romance and things like that. And I think that can actually be quite distracting and put a lot of pressure on a couple, because marriage is not just about sharing in the nice things. It's about sharing in like more important, I don't know, goals. So I think that's one thing. I don't know, I'm trying to think what else. Lots and lots of forgiveness. So we're not the perfect couple in any way, but one thing that helps us is that if you have forgiveness for one another, there's not much that can really get in the way. If we for Christ's sake we forgive one another, then even if we have a temper, that's on my side, or do something that is rude or whatever, there's always the option to forgive one another and ask for forgiveness wholeheartedly. What else? Yeah, I'll think of other things. Yeah, I can't think of it now. I'm not the best like marriage bachka, but marry a very good matryoshka that's kind and forgives you a lot. That's basically the secrets on my side. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Father. Thank you for sharing.
Any other? I think we should wrap it up, maybe, guys. It's getting late. But thank you all so much. Have a blessed evening, and next week we'll talk with some more difficult topics, but also very interesting and with lots of hope and lots of inspiration for us. So thank you everyone so much. Have a blessed evening, and I'll see you next week. Yeah.
Thank you, Father
Thank you,
Nicholas.
Father.
Thank you,
Father.
Father.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father Nicholas.